away at the eastern flank of Ukraine with an invasion that now is a full-scale one that he launched in 2022.
And the president has also said there would be severe consequences if he doesn't at least get a ceasefire today. As you said, ceasefire being a kind of accordion file that can be expanded depending on what actually happens. A late development that we've learned about recently is that though the White House said and talked at length about how it was going to be one-on-one, face-to-face with just an interpreter, now the grouping has grown. What does that suggest to you in terms of staffers with both presidents?
It's an interesting dynamic because you're exactly right. It's been described as sort of mano a mano, the two men meeting in this room. But now President Trump has put beside him his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and Special Envoy Witkoff, who has been the person ferrying back and forth for 5 times now to meet with Vladimir Putin as President Trump's envoy. So he's the one that proposal was relayed to just about a week ago, John. And it was that conversation they had that put this event together. And now having those 2 other individuals in the room does change the dynamic. I'd also emphasize something else that our Ellie Watson had reported, which is another new dynamic introduced this morning, and that is the Supreme Allied Commander is here in Washington, and so is President Trump's top military advisor. That's very interesting because we had been told that there wouldn't be discussion of territorial concessions or the war itself. It was just about a ceasefire. But now President Trump's top advisors are going to be here, those 2 men in uniform.
Well, and also, and we will learn whether the Secretary of Defense is also reported to be here, Pete Hegseth.
Pete Hegseth also, that was another addition.
And exactly, lots of additions that we're going to be talking about here in the moment. But
changing the dynamic
in this highly improvisational, as you were talking about yesterday, diplomacy here. I mean, people coming in and out of the agreement, in and out of the room. Also, the Secretary of the Treasury is reported to be here.
And the Commerce Secretary. That suggests a lot of business interest, perhaps. And one of the first ways this channel opened was through business outreach. This hedge fund manager, this investment advisor, Kirill Dmitriev, started meeting with Steve Witkoff. Actually, an introduction made by the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who had ties to this investor. And so it started from that with this promise that if you come to the table on Ukraine, you may see the benefit of increased economic ties.
Carrots and sticks being brought to this meeting. As we look at the 2 open doors facing each other in the first moment of choreography in what is likely to be a day full of these kinds of staged moments, let's go to Nancy Cortez, who's here with us in Anchorage, somewhere other than where we are. Nancy, what do you know?
Good to see you, John. Yes, I am on Joint Base Elmendorf as well, not at the tarmac, but in an event space that has been transformed into what will be a press conference site once these meetings have wrapped up. And President Trump has said that if the meeting goes well, he'll probably appear with Vladimir Putin. And we have 2 podiums set up behind us right now. But if they don't go well, he'll just do a press conference on his own and head back to Washington, D.C. As for the events as they are expected to unfold today, the Russians said this morning these meetings could last 6 to 7 hours. So very in-depth conversations, starting with that 3-on-3 that you and Margaret have been discussing, and then expanding into a larger lunch that will include additional top advisors to the president and to Putin, including the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and the president's chief of staff, Susie Wiles. The president has been expressing optimism. He wouldn't be meeting with Vladimir Putin if he didn't think that he could make progress. And even the Russians said just this morning that if things go well, Putin would be open to another meeting that includes Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. That in itself is notable because for years Putin has refused to meet with Zelensky, has refused to acknowledge that he is the legitimate leader of Ukraine. And so if he stands by those words, and that is a big if, then that would be truly significant, because President Trump has said that if today's talks bear fruit, if he believes that Putin is serious about wanting peace after 3.5 years, that he would arrange another meeting that includes all three leaders right away, perhaps here in Alaska. And there we see him at Air Force One right now.
The president descending the steps of Air Force One, making, not to put too much weight on it, but making the first move in this day of.
Indeed. And it was the Kremlin spokesperson who announced that Donald Trump, the president of the United States, would greet Vladimir Putin at the bottom of the stairs. We'll see if that prediction is correct. There he is himself. The president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, about to step onto United States soil for the very first time in a decade. And John, it is fascinating. It's here in Alaska, territory that was once part of the Russian Empire, sold to the United States at a time Russia was under financial strain due to its war in Crimea.
In Crimea, exactly, yes.
Another piece of territory we're talking about once again, something Russia wants to hold on to and has put extreme pressure on Vladimir Putin. I believe Ambassador John Sullivan, former U.S. ambassador to Russia under President Trump's first term, former Deputy Secretary of State during that time as well, is joining us. Ambassador, it is stunning, I'm sure, for all of you who have spent time with Vladimir Putin to watch him walk down a red carpet on a U.S. Air Force base with this kind of honored reception. What are your thoughts, and what do you think about what comes next in what will now be a three-way meeting?
Well, it really is an extraordinary event, Margaret. You talk about Putin being welcomed back into the world community after being charged with war crimes by the International Criminal Court, isolated on the world stage, and now he's welcomed in the United States walking down the red carpet. And the fact that they have an expanded delegations on both sides indicates to me that they're going to be talking about a lot more than just Ukraine, which is something the Russians really want. They want this to be a summit meeting between two presidents, not about peace in Ukraine.
There it is, the handshake. I wish we could hear what they are speaking to each other. Vladimir Putin does have some English. He was, of course, a Russian speaker there, and it looked like they had some pleasantries there. They just exchanged. And that military welcome, you know, we should know, John, that what we're also seeing there, the other planes, those are jets. There were also B-2 bombers brought in here that arrived yesterday. And some of that may be due to increased military exercises happening around here. Some of it may be, frankly, staging and a show of force.
Flex, as the kids would call it.
A flex.
As a flyover takes place as the two presidents walk towards yet another piece of stagecraft, Alaska 2025, for what we're told is just going to be another photo opportunity wrapped inside of a photo opportunity.
Ambassador Sullivan, you've been part of meetings with Oh, somebody is yelling there.
Mr. Putin, did you underestimate Ukraine?
The president is ignoring the questions about the ceasefire that are being shouted at him. Some pretty sharp.
The president of Russia pretending to not hear a question about the killing of civilians.
Yes, you heard that. This is on a U.S. military base, so this is a pretty controlled environment. The press was allowed to come in to shoot this arrival. These are pictures. Wow, is he getting into the beast? It looks like the doors are opening there on the president's vehicle, and that both gentlemen are getting in. The feed just went down there. We're seeing another angle of the vehicle. Even for a short trip, that's pretty extraordinary.
Right. Ambassador Sullivan, give us your take on the stagecraft. It might seem to some people to be frivolous. In other instances, particularly between the leaders of these two nations, it can be quite important. What do you make of now the fact that the two men are going to be riding over in private to their formal meeting?
Well, I contrast it with the last meeting that Putin had with an American president, with President Biden in Geneva 4 years ago. The two presidents arrived at a home in Geneva. They shook hands on the front steps and went into a meeting with their Secretary of State and this Russian foreign minister. There was nothing like this spectacular scenery with planes arriving, fighter jets flying overhead, and the two presidents riding together in the limousine of the President of the United States. This really is an extraordinary stagecraft that the United States has put together for President Putin.
Ambassador Sullivan, we're looking at a picture through the front window of the president's vehicle. All we can see are two gentlemen in the front seat, presumably Secret Service, and the two leaders in the back seat. That's also not standard. But I can't tell you if there's a translator in that car. It looked like Vladimir Putin was speaking in English to the President of the United States. How typical is that, or what should we be concerned about? Vladimir Putin there smiling, looking and acknowledging the crowds watching him. Ambassador, to not have a interpreter there for the president, does he need that buffer?
Well, I mean, presidents of the United States have met one-on-one with Russian or Soviet leaders, right? Reagan had his famous walk with Gorbachev. So it's happened before. In this case, Putin's English is much better than he lets on. He's not as fluent in English as he is in German. He can converse with the German chancellor in flawless German. His English isn't quite as good, but he could have a conversation with the president in English that President Trump would understand.
And tell me about the other gentlemen who will be joining the conversation, Ushakov and Lavrov. They have been in this diplomacy game for a very long time, longer certainly than Secretary Rubio and Steve Witkoff, who just recently became a diplomat.
Exactly. I mean, Foreign Minister Lavrov has been the foreign minister of the Russian Federation for 21 years. Before that, he was Russian ambassador to the United Nations for 10 years. Yuri Ushakov is the foreign policy advisor to the President Putin in the office of presidential administration. He's had that job for, I think, 17 years. And before that, he was the Russian ambassador to the United States. So these are two individuals, Lavrov and Ushakov, who are deeply steeped in all of the issues that the United States and Russia confront, whether it's Ukraine, arms control, you name it. These are very, very experienced diplomats. And I would contrast that, for example, with the president's personal representative, Ambassador Witkoff, Special Representative Witkoff, who's really never dealt with these issues until this year.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at a transcript of what President Trump said on board Air Force One before he landed. He said, "This meeting is about setting the table today, John. We're going to have another meeting if things work out, which will be very soon, or we are not going to have any more meetings at all, maybe ever." So perhaps these are just the opening pleasantries for what could be a tense meeting. But we're just looking at the replay of the arrival, which was a fairly friendly one.
Indeed, and the friendliness continues. Ambassador, going back to Margaret's point at the beginning here, remind us again the context of Vladimir Putin. I mean, there are many, many other countries in which he would receive the polar opposite of this kind of response. You understand him. You know about what moves him or doesn't move him. In diplomatic parlance, there's often the cliche of carrots and sticks. This is a bushel full of carrots when he arrives. give us your professional assessment of how that may or may not work with Vladimir Putin.
Well, it's certainly something that he craves. He wants this meeting. He wants to be on that, literally on that stage with the President of the United States. And I might say we talk about a second meeting following this meeting, potentially with President Zelensky. It's exactly what he doesn't want to give to Zelensky. Putin does not want to be seen on the same stage with Zelensky, giving him the credibility and the stature to deal with the Russian president. Trump is treating Putin the way Putin wants to be treated, and Putin is shunning Zelensky.
You know, John, I was speaking with a U.S. official earlier today, and I said, how are you feeling about this meeting? And he said to me, it's a toss-up. It's all up to Putin.
And what does that mean? Does that mean just yes, no on ceasefire, or is that a much more complicated, it's up to him on a number of different fronts?
I think it's on a number of different fronts, but really the argument for those who are pro-Ukraine in this administration are that ceasefire or the conversation's over. But what we were just talking about, all the other men in the room have different interests, economic interests, sanctions really being the motivation for Vladimir Putin to show up here in the first place. As we know, President Trump held back on some of the sanctions that and tariffs, secondary tariffs that he had talked about putting on Vladimir Putin. He is financially drained right now, so he has an incentive to continue to delay.
And Nancy Cordes, who's traveling with the president. Nancy, what's the White House explanation for the full staff up that has now taken place from what was described as a one-on-one meeting? Now, you could imagine negotiations going on in which, if they get through that question of a ceasefire, now the Russians can have a conversation with the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Treasury. The full bounty of U.S. relationships might be laid before them. Is that the context in which this grouping is put together, or just how's the White House explaining it?
John, we've asked the White House that very question. We haven't gotten a response yet because both they and the Russians were saying until President Trump landed that this was going to be a one-on-one meeting. Now suddenly it is a three-on-three. As you can imagine, Ukrainian leaders and European leaders more broadly are probably breathing a big sigh of relief about that, because they've all seen what has happened in the past when Donald Trump has been alone in a room with Vladimir Putin, most famously at that summit in Helsinki, Finland, back in 2018, where President Trump emerged from his meeting with Putin, did a joint press conference, just like we're anticipating will happen today, and said that he believed Vladimir Putin over all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies that said that Russia had meddled in the 2016 election. Their big fear going into this summit was that Trump would be swayed by Putin, that he would be persuaded by Putin to see his side of things on a whole variety of issues, from Ukrainian territory to Ukrainian membership in NATO and the EU and security guarantees for the Ukrainians, and on and on. So the fact that Marco Rubio is now going to be in that room, Steve Witkoff is now going to be in that room, and that it's not just going to be Trump and Putin is probably a major sign to the Europeans that things are going to go in the way that they hoped they would.
And I just want to remind our viewers now that you were looking at replay of the introduction of the two men, the reintroduction, the first time they'd been face-to-face since 2019 that we know about. And we are waiting on that sort of formal beginning of a meeting to happen. And we hope to see pictures of that shortly. I do want to turn to Samantha Vinograd, a national security contributor here at CBS News, who served during the Biden administration, to get some perspective, because, you know, Sam, it's been interesting to see how quickly the reshuffling has happened just in the past few hours of who's even participating. We know that the president's top military advisor, General Kane, has been added. He's got a lot of credibility, I am told, with the president. The Supreme Allied Commander is a statement, bringing him here to Alaska. I'm told he's got a very good feel for the fight in Ukraine. At first, the administration didn't want that military presence here, but then I'm told they thought it was best to have the war fighters here. What does that signal to you? Is that part of a flex? Does that signal to you that they're going to actually be part of a formal conversation?
Well, I will say, Margaret, having been part of summits at the head of state level in the past, the details on who's in a meeting often do finalize at the last minute. That's not totally unusual. Having these military advisors on the ground in Anchorage, I do think is a flex. I also think, to Nancy's point, it does send a signal that President Trump is allied and aligned, at least for now, with our allies in NATO, our allies in Europe. So that is a net positive. Having other advisors in the room for what was a one-on-one and now has turned into what we would call a restricted meeting, a smaller group meeting, is also a positive from a counterintelligence perspective. Having additional U.S. officials next to President Trump, rather than just a translator, will likely allow President Trump to be supported by individuals with information that he doesn't have, and for there to be a more comprehensive record of the meeting itself. That has been an issue in the past. So overall, the presence of these different officials is a net positive. And I will note that the presence of finance and investment advisors on both sides, both on the U.S. side and the Russian side, is probably viewed as a positive by Vladimir Putin, because he knows that investment and economic growth are a soft spot for President Trump. And so his ability to shift the conversation toward enhancing U.S.-Russia bilateral economic ties, which would include the lifting of sanctions and export controls, is likely something that President Putin views as a positive from a participation perspective.
I want to bring in senior foreign correspondent Deborah Patta on this question of the European view. Deborah, Volodymyr Zelensky is obviously not here. It's the fate of his country that is in part, well, not in part, in whole, being discussed. The moral question of whether a stronger country can just cross the borders of another is up in the air. All of these things are obviously acute concerns to Volodymyr Zelensky, but also to the leaders of Europe. Give us the viewpoint from there and the way in which they would be watching these pictures unfold as the American president welcomes Vladimir Putin, who they spend most of their time fearful is going to create mischief in their neighborhood.
Well, let's talk firstly of Ukraine, John. I mean, we spoke to a number of prominent Ukrainians today who say that their expectations are very low from this meeting. They don't think things can get any worse. Their fighting rages on in Ukraine. There were strikes today in Sumy, in Dnipro, in Zaporizhia and Kherson. And they say that that's not a sign that there's going to be any kind of ceasefire. And this was in the run-up to today's meeting. And I think there's anxiety. There's a fear that maybe Putin could outplay President Trump. From the European side, they've tried this week to really bring President Trump on board. There was that Zoom call, a big video call with all the leaders in Europe, from the UK, from Germany, from France, from Italy, the head of NATO, the head of the EU, as well as President Trump and Vice President Vance, and of course, the man who is not there today, President Zelensky of Ukraine. And in that meeting, they came up with 5 principles. But the key one is that there should not be any talk about any land being swapped or retained without a ceasefire, that there needs to be a ceasefire first. And I think that is the anxiety that they'll be looking forward to see. Will that hold? They certainly breathed a sigh of relief, because after that meeting, President Trump said he rated it a 10 and that any discussion about land would be up to Ukraine. But this is a mercurial president, and things could happen in that meeting that are not foreseen. So there is a lot of anxiety. And in Ukraine, that expectation, that very low expectation, is also a psychological blow. One very prominent Ukrainian said to us today that this was unthinkable, that an American president could meet, in their words, with a man accused of war crimes, John.
And if you're Volodymyr Zelensky watching these images, such a contrast, the red carpet being rolled out for the Russian president, and here we have the first pictures of them meeting. The red carpet being rolled out for the Russian president, contrasted with Volodymyr Zelensky's confrontational meeting in the Oval Office.
You can.
Putin, why should President Trump trust your word now?
Thank you, press. Thank you, press.
We've got to go.
Thank you, press.
Thank you, press. Thank you, press. Thank you, press.
You can hear the press handlers there trying to usher the press out of the room. You have a train here behind John and I at the same time. Quite the cacophony.
The train is not a part of the official proceedings, but it does add a certain background chaos to what is a bit of a chaotic moment as they try to get the...
You know, in that, it's interesting just to point out that the Russian president is not accustomed to a free press being able to get that close to him and ask him very sharp questions as they just did. You heard those questions. When are you going to stop killing civilians? When is the war going to end? And you could see there in that shaky picture him going, I don't know. He was able to carry a conversation when he landed, but he said he couldn't understand the reporters. President Trump said something we couldn't quite make out there. We'll get that on the tape playback. But one of the things I want to just emphasize here, John, is there's a lot for these men to talk to besides Ukraine, which is a huge and complex problem. Oh, here we go.
Will you agree to a ceasefire? Mr. Putin, will you commit to not killing any more civilians?
Come on, guys.
Mr. President Putin,
yeah, we still can't hear what is being said there. You can see Sergei Lavrov, the president of Russia's top diplomat, on the far side of the screen there. But what I was starting to say there, John, is Ukraine's not the only piece of territory that Vladimir Putin wants to talk about. One of the other things that is of concern, and a U.S. official brought this up to me, that the arms control agreement, the New START agreement that the U.S. and Russia have, expires in February. Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And for Donald Trump, he is uniquely fascinated by nuclear weapons. And so there's concern what can be brought to the table that would change the conversation away from Ukraine to something that President Trump wants to talk about. It's not just the investment deals, it's what's in it for the United States. And so arms control, is that part of the conversation that could happen here today? What are the things that could distract, still be very important, don't get me wrong, but take us away from the Ukraine focus?
Distract and also try to create a different sense of leverage, which is to say Vladimir Putin trying to argue for other ways in which the U.S. has interests or has an interest in good relations with Russia.
Yes.
And so to kind of rebalance things, the president, by the way, we should note, coming in here, has a couple of different times, both on Air Force One and in the Oval Office yesterday, said things like, he's not going to mess with me. He's not, so some kind of bellicose talk before a very non-bellicose greeting. You wouldn't expect the greeting to be overly bellicose, so that's not crazy. But just in terms of, the president thinks in terms of leverage, as we remember from his conversation with Vladimir Zelensky. Who has the power to make Russia do what the president wants? And do you think, Margaret, when you're reporting, how realistic do you think it is what a lot of analysts have said, which is that Donald Trump really needs to tell Vladimir Putin, listen, I'm going to keep arming the Ukrainians, and you're not going to win this war. So let's focus on ending it. How? Right. That, a lot of analysts talk about that. Is that, do you hear, does that come up in your interviews with people who are engaged in actually trying to make this peace happen?
Those things are certainly leverage for the president if he wanted to use that leverage. And that's the thing that makes this so different from all diplomatic summits that I have ever covered in my life, which is President Trump's own convictions on this issue have changed wildly over the past few months. Most recently, he has seemed to be frustrated with Vladimir Putin. Knock it off, Vladimir. Stop it. You know, he said things like that he is personally troubled with the attacks on civilians. But he's also been very frustrated with Volodymyr Zelensky. I'm being told to wrap.
Yes, we are. Here we got apparently a better account of the beginning or the top of the meeting.
We can't hear any sound. Perhaps our viewers can.
All right. This is this potentially could be better sound or a better caption at the top of this meeting. It's morsels at this point that we're gathering from the two presidents, but not unimportant ones as they both try to shape the narrative going into this, you know, Margaret, I think back to the Cold War meetings between the leaders of these countries, which were in a much different context, but a lot of it was about a story. Who has control of the larger story? Here we see President Trump talking, but we can't hear him. Because the story becomes the thing that then the Europeans have to react to, that Vladimir Zelensky has to react to, the Chinese who are watching this very closely. You know, it seems in some sense superficial, on the other hand, quite important as people tell the story of what happened here in Alaska.
Well, you raised so many great points in that, and also in pointing to what has changed in the dynamic. You know, we saw the top diplomat from Russia arrive here wearing a CCP, a throwback to the Soviet Union shirt, which seemed to be sort of almost a joking reminder. But so much has changed in the dynamic. Russia is not. They have the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, but they don't have a really bustling economy. They've become incredibly dependent on China, that you just mentioned that. So the dynamic here of what happens in this room and the projection of power, both for the United States, its interests, and what you can get away with. Is this today a reward for bad behavior? As many analysts worry, it sets a precedent. Is it a sign to China's Xi Jinping that, oh, you can just invade another country by force, and you know, if you can find a win-win solution, get away with it. That's why this is being so parsed and so analyzed. Even though Russia is in somewhat of a weak position, it still has leverage in many, many ways.
Ambassador Sullivan is joining us again. John Sullivan, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia and the former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State. So, Ambassador, Margaret mentioned a sweatshirt, which seems quite insignificant. However, because Margaret mentioned it, it's not. And can you help people understand the mindset of Vladimir Putin and the mistake that he believes that Russia made during the period after the Soviet Union fell apart, during the Yeltsin years, and the restoration he's looking forward to, which is a part of what inspired the move into Ukraine? That is to say that the USSR is an honored and honorable part of Russia's history, and that's much closer to the Vladimir Putin who is here today. Help us understand, and people understand the mindset and why that's so important to him.
It really goes to the core of who Putin is. And he said this many years ago, decades ago, that he considers the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the demise of the Soviet Union. And what does he mean by that? He's not talking about Soviet communism. Putin isn't a communist. I mean, Putin has been known to say, many Russians do, if you're not nostalgic for how we lived in Soviet days, you don't have a heart. But if you want to return to Soviet communism, you don't have a brain. No, what he's talking about is the Soviet Empire, and before that, the Russian Empire. That's what he laments, the demise of that empire. When the Soviet Union collapsed, that international border, that huge country, the USSR, 15 Soviet republics, 350 million people controlled by Moscow. That international border disappeared. The internal boundaries of the Soviet Union became international borders, and among other things, that separated Ukraine from Russia. That's the great catastrophe that Putin has spent much of his life since the demise of the Soviet Union trying to restore control over all that territory, power, and peoples that were lost when the Soviet Union collapsed.
And we are waiting on that tape playback from that meeting. I'm told we'll be able to hear what was said. But Ambassador, just quickly there, I don't know if you can see these pictures, but we see there what looked like two translators alongside Witkoff, Rubio, Ushakov, and Lavrov. In the dynamic in the room, how do you expect that this next hour is going to play out?
Well, you know, we saw a similar setup. I was with President Biden when he met with Putin in Geneva in June of 21. It was just Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov, but seated to the either side of the two presidents. By the way, there was a press scrum at the start of that meeting, and there was similar reaction by Putin, hostility to reporters asking questions.
Well, we're about to hear, Ambassador, that tape playback. Let's listen in.
Sorry.
Can you make a deal with that, sir?
Just go up.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, press. Thank you, press. Thank you, press.
Mr. Putin, will you
Press. Thank you, press. Thank you, press. Thank you, press. Let's go. Thank you, press. Thank you, press. Thank you, press. Let's go. Come on, guys.
Come on, guys. Let's go. Let's go.
Thank you, press.
Let's go.
Okay, well, that was what we heard. What happened? Unlikely to go into the annals of foreign policy history.
Vladimir Putin said something.
He said something we
can't make out.
Still didn't hear it. One more question for you, Ambassador Sullivan. Can you give us a sense of the rhythm of these conversations you have? Putin has that variable level of English that he understands. There are translators, complicated issues. How do the rhythms of these conversations go? And how do you get anything done with all of that kind of intermediary translating and mixed messages?
Well, he will usually use a translator. In a meeting like this, he won't trust his English. He'll want to speak in Russian, and there'll be translation. And that naturally delays things, even if there's simultaneous translation. What Putin is notorious for, and he did this famously with President Obama, he will go off on a soliloquy and just start talking, and it may be difficult for the American president to get a word in edgewise. It will be interesting to see how Putin handles this meeting with Trump. When I saw Putin dealing with President Biden, Putin was very relaxed. He was cracking jokes. He wasn't standing on a soapbox and giving a lot of speeches. We'll see how he deals with President Trump here today.
There is another room being prepared that I think the world will be watching very closely in the next few hours. Once the closed-door meeting happens, once the business concludes, there are plans for both gentlemen to walk out to a stage and take questions in a joint press conference. That will be newsworthy. The last time they did that was in Helsinki in 2018, John. It was a press conference that had major reverberations domestically for the president, who has long been frustrated by U.S. intelligence conclusions that Russia did interfere in the 2016 election to hurt his then opponent, Hillary Clinton, and ultimately to benefit him. He has recently brought that up all over again. At that time, remember, he said he took Vladimir Putin's word. And that had big reverberations. So there are high expectations, not just for the people of Ukraine today, the cost of this war and what might come out of the meetings, but this is going to have major impact. And Nancy Cordes is there waiting hours in advance of that. Nancy, if things don't go well in this room, should they really have two podiums set up?
If things don't go well in these meetings, Margaret, I think one of these two podiums is going to be moved off the stage. I'm just going to move to the side so you can see how things are set up right now, however. You do see the two podiums. You see that slogan, pursuing peace, that was also in the backdrop for President Trump's meeting with Vladimir Putin. And so the hope is that both men will stand at those podiums once these meetings have wrapped up. What will have to happen between now and then in order for that to take place, President Trump has said, is a sign that Putin is ready for peace. More specifically, that he either agrees to a ceasefire in these talks today or shows significant progress in being willing to accept a ceasefire. For the past several years, his demands in exchange for a ceasefire or an all-out end to the war have been very long, and many observers would say completely unrealistic. We often talk about territory, but his wish list goes far beyond territory. Yes, he wants to control the 20% or so of Ukrainian territory that he has managed to seize over the past 3.5 years. But he also wants promises that Ukraine will never join NATO. He wants Western allies to stop supplying Ukraine with military weaponry. He wants Ukraine's military to be scaled back. He'd even like to see a new government in Ukraine that is more friendly to Russia. In other words, a puppet government in the mold of what we used to see in Ukraine. And so does he move off of any of those positions today? That will really be the key, and that will really determine whether we end up with two podiums and two presidents at the end of the day today.
Nancy Cordes, thank you. As Nancy said, President Trump and President Putin will hold that joint press conference later. At the moment, what's taking place is they are getting down to brass tacks. The questions we've been analyzing are, in fact, now being discussed as we speak. And we will bring the press conference to you live when it happens. Until then, our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm John Dickerson with Margaret Brennan in Anchorage, Alaska.